The plains of Montana stretched endlessly, a frozen sea of white and gray where wind howled like an unquiet ghost. In the heart of that wilderness stood a weathered ranch house, solid, lonely, and silent, much like the man who owned it. Elias Ward had once been known as a man of easy laughter and steady hands, the kind neighbors trusted and children waved to as he passed through town. But that was 10 years ago, before tragedy stripped him of the life he knew and turned him into what folks now called the silent rancher. Elias had not always been silent. In his youth, his voice carried warmth, his words full of kindness and quiet humor. He'd built this ranch with his wife, Margaret, their dream carved out of dust, hope, and love. Together, they'd planned a life full of children, laughter, and cattle grazing as far as the eye could see. But dreams are fragile things. When Margaret died in childbirth, along with their stillborn son, Elias's voice died too. No scream escaped him then, no weeping stormed his face. He simply stopped. After the funeral, he sold their small house in town and withdrew to the far edges of his property, where no one came unless they had to. He worked the land in silence, mending fences, feeding cattle, fixing roofs, never asking for help, never offering more than a nod to travelers. Some said grief had stolen his voice. Others whispered that the shock had simply broken him. Whatever the reason, Elias found comfort in quiet. The world could not hurt him if he did not speak to it. He rose before dawn each day, moving with a slow, steady rhythm: coffee, chores, horses, tools. His only company was a gray mare named June, too old to work but loyal enough to follow him everywhere. Elias spoke to her in his head sometimes, the way lonely men do. She never answered, but he felt less alone when she was near. The townsfolk respected him from a distance. They said his silence was a kind of strength, a man too proud to complain, too broken to pretend. Children dared each other to ride past his ranch, claiming the silent man could read minds or talk to ghosts. Elias heard the rumors but cared little. Words were useless. They had failed him once before. That winter was the harshest in a decade. Snow fell for days without stopping, wind cutting through the valley like a blade. The cattle huddled near the barn, and Elias spent long nights keeping fires alive, patching leaks, and checking traps. He barely slept, surviving on black coffee and habit. The silence, though constant, began to feel heavier, as though even the world had grown tired of speaking to him. Then came the night that broke the stillness. The storm was fierce, the kind that turned the land into a blur of white and wind. Elias had just finished securing the barn door when he saw something move at the far edge of his property. Small, stumbling, and barely visible through the snow. At first he thought it was an animal, but as he squinted through the flakes, he realized it was a person, a figure wrapped in tattered cloth trying desperately to stay upright. For a long moment, Elias stood frozen, unsure if what he saw was real. He hadn't had a visitor in months, much less in the middle of a storm. Then instinct overrode hesitation. He grabbed his lantern and trudged into the wind. The closer he got, the clearer the sight became. A young woman, her lips blue, her hair matted with frost. She reached toward him weakly before collapsing against the fence post. Elias caught her before she hit the ground, her body frighteningly light in his arms. Her breath came in shallow gasps, her skin cold as the snow beneath them. Without a word, he lifted her and carried her toward the house, the lantern's light swaying in the darkness like a fragile promise. That night, for the first time in 10 years, Elias Ward wasn't alone. He didn't know who she was or what storm had driven her to his door, but as he crossed the threshold, the silent rancher felt something stir inside him. Something he hadn't felt since the day Margaret died. A heartbeat louder than the wind. A reason to care again. When Elias Ward laid the young woman on the worn couch beside the fire, she looked half frozen, half dreaming. Her lips trembled, her breath coming in shallow gasps that fogged the air. He moved quickly, tossing more logs into the hearth until the flames leapt high, chasing the cold shadows from the cabin. Then he fetched a quilt, one that had once belonged to his late wife, though he hadn't used it in years, and wrapped it tightly around the girl. For a long time, Elias simply stood there, unsure what to do. The storm raged outside, wind screaming against the walls, but all he could hear was the faint sound of her breathing. She looked fragile, almost like she might shatter if touched too roughly. A bruise darkened her cheek, and her small hands were raw from cold. Every instinct told him to stay distant, to do what was necessary and nothing more. But something about her drew him closer. After a while, her eyes fluttered open. They were a soft gray blue, unfocused at first, then sharp with fear. She flinched when she saw him, a large man standing silently near the firelight, his face half in shadow, his broad frame blocking the storm's glare through the window. "Where am I?" she whispered, her voice hoarse and small. Elias knelt beside her and pointed toward the window. "Ward Ranch," he muttered, the words rough from disuse. It startled even him to hear his own voice after so long. She blinked, processing the name, her brow furrowed. "You," she swallowed hard, "you're the rancher who never talks, aren't you?" He said nothing this time, just gave a slow nod. His silence made her uneasy at first, but then she relaxed, realizing he wasn't a threat. There was something steady in his presence, solid, unspoken comfort that made the small cabin feel safer than it had a moment before. She shivered, teeth chattering. "Just for a moment, sir. It's so cold." Her voice was faint, trembling like the fire's glow. Elias hesitated only a second before shrugging off his heavy wool coat and draping it around her shoulders. It nearly swallowed her whole, the sleeves hanging past her hands. She sank into it, sighing softly as warmth began to seep back into her limbs. He turned away then, hiding the flicker of emotion that passed through him. The sound of her voice, soft and unsure, had stirred something deep and painful inside. He busied himself at the stove, heating broth from the night before, though his hands weren't steady. When he brought her the steaming bowl, she tried to sit up but winced, clutching her side. Without a word, he helped her, gently, carefully, until she could sip the soup. She whispered a quiet thank you, and for the first time in years, Elias met another's eyes without flinching. After she finished, he gestured for her to rest, but she shook her head, blinking away tears. "I shouldn't be here," she said softly. "I didn't mean to trespass, I just didn't know where else to go." Elias frowned, his rough hand setting the bowl aside. He could see it now, the dirt on her shoes, the torn hem of her dress, the faint marks around her wrists. Whoever she was, life had not been kind. He pointed to the quilt. "Sleep," he said quietly, the single word more command than comfort. But before lying down, she asked in a voice so fragile it nearly broke him, "You're not going to send me away, are you?" The question hung in the air like smoke. Elias didn't answer right away. He didn't know how. Sending her away would be the logical thing, what any cautious man would do. But as he looked at her trembling form by the fire, her eyes heavy with exhaustion and fear, he knew he couldn't. He shook his head once. No. A faint smile curved her lips before sleep claimed her. Elias sat in the chair across from her, staring into the fire as snow beat against the windows. He should have felt burdened, but instead he felt something else. For the first time in years, the silence inside him didn't feel so heavy. It felt alive. When morning came, the storm had passed, leaving behind a world of pure white and glittering stillness. Sunlight broke through the clouds, shining on the drifts of snow piled high against the barn and fences. Inside the cabin, the fire had burned low, but warmth lingered. Elias Ward was already awake, his movements quiet as he set coffee to boil and checked the firebox. He'd been up most of the night watching the young woman sleep, making sure her breathing stayed even, that the cold hadn't stolen her away while he wasn't looking. When she finally stirred, it was with a soft groan and a wince. Her eyes blinked open, dazed but clearer than before. For a moment, she seemed confused about where she was. Then, seeing Elias by the stove, she tensed, half ready to run before remembering she could barely stand. "You're awake," he said, his voice rough from disuse. She nodded, clutching the blanket tighter around her. I didn't mean to fall asleep here. You were freezing," he interrupted, pouring a cup of coffee and placing it carefully on the table beside her. "Drink," the word was firm but not unkind. She obeyed, her hands trembling as she lifted the cup to her lips. The first sip made her cough, but then she smiled faintly. "It's strong." Elias allowed the smallest hint of a nod. Silence filled the cabin again, broken only by the crackle of firewood. It wasn't an uncomfortable silence this time, more like two strangers measuring the edges of trust. After a while, she set the cup down and drew a shaky breath. "My name's Clara," she said softly. "Clara Bennett." She looked at him expectantly, but when he didn't answer, she added in a whisper, "You probably want to know why I was out there." He didn't nod, but his eyes told her to go on. Clara looked down, twisting the hem of the blanket between her fingers. I used to live east of here. My mother passed 2 years ago, and my stepfather, well, he wasn't much of a father. Her voice trembled. He sold off everything she owned, said I owed him for feeding me. Then, she hesitated, her lips tightening. Then he said he'd found someone who'd take me off his hands for a price. Elias's jaw tightened. He'd heard of men like that. Cowards who hid their cruelty behind whiskey and debt. I ran, Clara continued, her voice barely a whisper now. I didn't know where to go, just that I had to get away. I heard there was work in a town west of here. So I walked. 2 days, maybe 3. Then the storm hit. She swallowed hard. I thought I was going to die out there. Her words faded into silence. Elias said nothing, but inside him something stirred, a deep, steady anger that burned cold and clean. No one deserved what she'd endured, least of all someone her age. She couldn't have been more than 18, still more child than woman. After a long pause, Clara looked up at him again. If you want me gone, I understand. I'll leave when the snow melts a little. I don't mean to cause trouble. Elias's eyes softened. He didn't trust words, but his expression spoke volumes. He shook his head once, then pointed toward the fire. Stay until you're strong. Clara blinked, startled. You mean it? He gave a brief nod and stood, turning toward the door. There was work to do, and he didn't want her to see the strange tightness in his chest, the old ache that came whenever someone looked at him with gratitude instead of pity. When he stepped outside, the cold hit him like a reminder of who he was, a man made of silence, loss, and habit. But this morning, for the first time in years, he felt a flicker of something unfamiliar, purpose. Inside, through the frosted window, Clara sipped her coffee and pulled his coat tighter around her shoulders. It was too big for her, heavy and worn, but she smiled faintly as if its weight made her feel safe. Neither of them knew it yet. But that one act of kindness, a coat given to a stranger, had already begun to thaw 2 lives that had been frozen far too long. Over the next several days, the storm melted away, leaving behind patches of earth and puddles of thawing snow. The air was still sharp, but the worst of winter had passed. Inside the cabin, the change was quieter, slower, but no less real. Elias Ward's house, once filled only with silence and the creak of wood, now had a heartbeat again. Clara moved carefully at first, as if afraid to disturb the fragile peace she'd found. She insisted on helping where she could, washing dishes, sweeping floors, tending the small fire that never seemed to die down. Elias didn't stop her. He watched in quiet amazement as the rhythm of her movements softened the cold edges of his days. She talked sometimes while she worked, little things mostly. Memories of her mother's garden, the smell of lilacs in spring, the way her mother used to hum while mending clothes. Elias never replied, but he listened. And though he said nothing, Clara began to sense that he heard her in a way no one else ever had. He spent his days repairing the barn, mending fences, and checking the cattle. Each evening when he returned to the cabin, Clara would have a meal waiting. It wasn't much. Bread, stew, sometimes beans. But to him it felt like something he hadn't tasted in a decade. Home. Once, as she set a plate before him, she smiled and said, "You're lucky, you know. Not everyone gets to live somewhere this peaceful." Elias looked up from his food, his weathered face unreadable. He wanted to tell her that peace and loneliness can look the same when you're living inside them, but he couldn't form the words. So instead, he nodded and went on eating. That night, as the wind sighed softly through the trees outside, Clara sat by the fire with her mending kit. She glanced at Elias, who sat in his usual chair near the window, carving a piece of wood with slow precision. "Can I ask you something?" she said quietly. He looked up. "Why don't you talk much?" He froze for a moment, his knife hovering above the half-carved piece of pine. His eyes met hers, steady, dark, unreadable. Then he set the knife down and looked into the fire instead. Clara's voice softened. "You don't have to tell me if you don't want to. It's just, you seem like someone who's carrying something heavy." He didn't move for a long time. The flames flickered across his face, lighting the deep lines that grief had carved there. Then finally he spoke, barely above a whisper. "I was married." Clara blinked, surprised that he'd spoken at all. "She died," he said simply. as if the words themselves were too heavy to carry any further. Clara didn't ask how or when or why. She just lowered her gaze, her voice soft. "I'm sorry." Elias nodded once, his throat tight. That was all there was to say. After that night, something subtle shifted between them. Clara stopped treating him like a stranger and began to see him as something else, a protector perhaps, or maybe just another lost soul like herself. She respected his quiet, spoke less, and listened more, and Elias, though still silent, found comfort in her presence. She reminded him of the world outside his grief, the small living world he'd once loved and thought he'd buried. Days turned into weeks. Snow melted into streams, and the first signs of spring began to show in the valleys below. Life was creeping back into the land, and unknowingly into Elias's heart as well. Sometimes when Clara laughed, soft and shy, he felt something strange stir inside him. Not the pain of loss, but something gentler. Hope, maybe, or the faint memory of warmth. She didn't belong to his world, and he told himself she'd leave when the roads cleared. But when he caught her humming by the fire, the sound light and human in a house that had known nothing but silence, he found himself wishing, just for a moment, that she'd stay. Spring crept over the valley slowly, like a shy visitor testing the door. The snow melted into muddy streams. The air softened, and green began to peek through the brown. Life returned to the land, and with it came movement, travelers, and whispers from nearby towns. But for Elias Ward, the world beyond his fence line still felt distant. His life had settled into a rhythm again, steady and strange. The mornings filled with chores, the evenings filled with quiet companionship. Clara had healed. Her color had returned. Her hands no longer shook from cold, and though her clothes were patched and plain, she carried herself with more confidence now. She'd even begun to tease him occasionally. "Do you ever smile, Mr. Ward?" she asked one afternoon, her hands deep in soapy water as she washed dishes. Elias, mending tack near the window, didn't look up. "Sometimes," she grinned. "I'll believe that when I see it." He didn't answer, but the corner of his mouth twitched, the closest thing to a smile anyone had seen in years. Clara laughed softly, a sound that filled the room like sunlight. For a moment it almost felt like they'd always shared this small, strange peace. But peace is a fragile thing. It shatters easily under the weight of the past. It happened one afternoon when a rider appeared on the horizon. Elias spotted him while repairing the corral fence. A lone man on a dark horse, riding slow but with purpose. Something about his posture made Elias uneasy. He wiped his hands on his coat and watched as the stranger dismounted near the gate, his eyes scanning the ranch. "Ward Ranch?" the man called, his voice rough. Elias gave a single nod, saying nothing. The rider smirked. "Word in town says you took in a girl a few weeks back. Young thing. Brown hair. Goes by the name Clara." Elias's jaw tightened. "Why?" "Because she's mine," the man said, stepping closer. His breath smelled of whiskey and bitterness. "She ran off and I aimed to take her back." Elias's silence deepened into something colder. He straightened slowly, his height casting a shadow over the man. "She's no one's property," the stranger sneered. "You think she told you the truth? You think she's some innocent little dove? She's a liar and a thief. She ran off with what wasn't hers." Elias said nothing. But when the man tried to push past him, Elias moved, swift, solid, immovable as a wall. His hand caught the man's arm mid-step. "You'll turn around," he said quietly. "Now." The rider yanked free, his face flushing with anger. "You'll regret this, old man. You think you can hide her? The law'll side with me." "Then bring it," Elias replied, his voice steady but fierce. The man spat in the dirt, mounted his horse, and rode off, but not before throwing one last warning over his shoulder. "I'll be back, and I won't come alone." When Elias returned to the cabin, Clara was standing by the window, her face pale. She'd heard every word. "That was him," she whispered, her voice breaking. "My stepfather." Elias nodded once, his expression unreadable. "He won't touch you." Tears filled her eyes. "You shouldn't have gotten involved. He'll come back. He always does." Elias looked at her then. Really looked at her. She was trembling, just like that first night, and something deep inside him stirred again, stronger this time. "I've already lost one person I couldn't protect," he said quietly. "I won't lose another." The words came out rough, almost foreign, but true. Clara stared at him, stunned by the conviction in his voice. For the first time since she'd arrived, she saw past the silence and the scars, to the man who still had courage buried beneath all that grief. That night, Elias sat by the fire long after Clara had gone to bed. He stared into the flames, the memories of his wife and unborn son flickering behind his eyes. He had built his silence to keep the past buried, but now, because of a frightened girl with trembling hands, the walls were breaking. He was speaking again, feeling again, protecting again, and though he didn't yet realize it, Elias Ward was learning that ghosts only lose their power when you stop running from them and start fighting for the living. The morning after the confrontation, the air in the cabin felt different, tense, alive, and strangely fragile. Clara moved about quietly, tidying dishes and sweeping the hearth, but her mind wasn't on her chores. Every creak of the floorboards, every distant sound of hooves in the hills made her flinch. The thought of her stepfather returning filled her with dread. Elias, meanwhile, had been up before sunrise. He saddled his horse, checked the rifle he hadn't touched in years, and rode the perimeter of his land. The earth was thawing, but the tracks from the stranger's horse still cut deep into the soft ground. Elias followed them for a while, making sure the man had indeed gone east, back toward town. Only when he was certain did he return home. When he entered the cabin, Clara was kneeling by the fire, her hands folded as if in prayer. She looked up, startled. You came back?" Elias raised an eyebrow. "Didn't plan on leaving," she smiled faintly, though her eyes still carried worry. "You shouldn't have stood up to him. He's cruel when he's cornered." Elias shrugged off his coat and set his rifle by the door. "Let him try," he said simply. His voice was calm, but beneath it was a quiet steel Clara hadn't heard before. For a while, neither spoke. He poured her a cup of coffee, and she accepted it with both hands. As the warmth seeped through her fingers, she glanced at him, at his rough hands, his strong shoulders, the lines around his eyes that spoke of years spent in solitude. He was not a man easily shaken, yet she could tell that something in him had changed since her arrival. "Why did you do it?" she asked finally. "Why stand up for me?" "You don't even know me." Elias leaned against the table, his gaze fixed on the window. Outside, the light shimmered across the fields like liquid gold. "Maybe I don't need to," he said softly. "Maybe knowing what it's like to lose someone is enough." Clara's breath caught. She understood then that his silence wasn't just habit. It was armor. Every word he spoke was weighed, measured, costly. And yet for her he'd begun to use them again. Over the following weeks, their bond deepened in quiet, unspoken ways. Elias taught her how to ride June, his aging mare, and how to mend a broken fence. Clara brought laughter into the house again, humming softly while she worked, sometimes teasing him for his one-word answers. One afternoon, as they worked side by side stacking hay, Clara said, "You know, I used to think silence meant emptiness, but yours, it feels like peace." Elias glanced at her, surprised. "Peace?" She nodded. "It's steady, like a river that doesn't need to prove it's moving." For a long time he didn't reply, but her words stayed with him. That night, while she slept by the fire, Elias sat at the table staring at the coat she'd first worn when he found her. It still hung on the chair near the door, patched now where she'd mended a tear. That coat had been the first thing he'd given her, an act of instinct, maybe mercy. But somewhere between that stormy night and now, something had changed. She had given him something in return, warmth. The kind that didn't come from fire or blankets, but from laughter, from presence, from being seen. The ranch, once hollow and cold, was alive again. Chickens clucked in the yard. The smell of stew filled the air, and sometimes, just sometimes, Elias caught himself humming as he worked. Clara noticed the difference too. "You're changing," she said one evening as they watched the sunset paint the hills pink and gold. Elias smiled faintly. "Maybe I'm remembering." "Remembering what?" "That it's still worth living," he said quietly. For a moment, Clara couldn't speak. The silence that followed wasn't heavy, it was tender. She reached out, placing her hand gently over his. "You've already given me warmth, sir," she said softly. "More than your coat ever could." He looked at her hand resting on his, and something deep within him, something long frozen, finally began to thaw. That night, when the fire burned low, Elias sat awake, listening to the soft rhythm of Clara's breathing. The ghosts of his past still lingered in the corners of the room, but for the first time they didn't haunt him. They simply watched quietly as the man who had once lived in silence began to feel alive again. By late spring, the valley had turned green again. Wildflowers scattered across the fields like confetti, and the cattle grazed lazily under a sun that finally held warmth instead of threat. The long months of cold and fear were behind them, or so it seemed. Life on the ranch had fallen into an easy rhythm. Elias and Clara worked side by side each day, and though words were still few between them, their silences had changed. They were no longer empty. They were full of understanding. Clara had grown stronger, her cheeks flushed with health, her laughter brighter. She moved with confidence now, no longer the frightened girl he'd found in the snow. Sometimes when she caught Elias watching her with quiet pride, she'd blush though she tried to hide it behind teasing words. "You're staring again," she said one afternoon, balancing a basket of eggs on her hip. "Just making sure you don't drop those," he replied, his tone steady but his lips twitching into a near smile. She grinned. "You worry too much. Someone has to." The easy exchange brought warmth to the house and to Elias's heart, a feeling he hadn't allowed himself in years. Yet beneath the calm, he couldn't quite shake the sense that the peace they'd found was fragile. The world had a cruel way of testing the things that made life worth living. His worry proved right not long after. A rider came from town, Marshal Latham, a tall man with a weathered face and an official tone. He dismounted at the gate, tipping his hat politely. "Ward," he called. "Need a word with you." Elias stepped out, cautious. Clara, sensing trouble, appeared in the doorway, clutching her apron. The marshal's expression was kind but serious. "That stepfather of hers, Jacob Bennett, he's gone. Found dead by the river 3 days ago." Clara gasped softly, her hand flying to her mouth. "Dead?" Latham nodded. "No foul play suspected. Probably drink and bad footing. But there's more. Turns out the man had debts all over the territory. The law's clear. You're free to go, miss. No one's looking for you anymore." For a long moment, Clara said nothing. The words hung in the air like a door swinging open. "Free to go." The marshal tipped his hat again. "Glad you're safe, miss. You've got good luck finding shelter here." Then he rode off, leaving dust swirling behind him. Elias turned toward her, his expression unreadable. "You're free now," he said quietly. Clara looked at him, her eyes uncertain. "Free?" she repeated softly, as if the word felt strange in her mouth. That night she sat by the fire long after Elias had gone to bed, staring into the flames. Freedom should have felt like relief. Instead, it felt like loss. She could go anywhere now, start over in town, find work, maybe even friends her own age. But when she looked around the cabin, the mended curtains, the smell of pine wood, the quiet strength of the man who had given her shelter, she realized something she hadn't before. This place wasn't just a refuge anymore. It had become home. The next morning, Elias found her outside, packing the old wagon with supplies. His chest tightened at the sight. "You leaving?" Clara turned, startled. "I know. Not unless you want me to." Elias frowned slightly, confusion crossing his face. "I thought about it," she said, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "About what comes next. But I realized I don't want to go back to wandering. I want to build something. Here, if you'll have me." Elias stared at her for a long moment. Words caught somewhere between his heart and his mouth. The wind rustled through the fields, and the air smelled faintly of wild sage. Finally he said, "This isn't an easy life." "I know. It's lonely sometimes." She smiled softly. "Not anymore." Something in her voice broke through the last of his hesitation. He nodded once, his eyes softening. "Then stay." Her answering smile lit up the morning. That day they worked side by side, repairing a fence post that had fallen in the wind. The sun was warm, the grass high, and for the first time in years, Elias felt no weight pressing on his shoulders. The ranch wasn't silent anymore. It was alive, with laughter, with hope, with the promise of something new, a beginning born not out of rescue, but out of choice. Summer came softly to the valley, the air rich with the scent of grass and rain. The hills glowed green under the golden sun, and the ranch, Elias Ward's once empty refuge, now thrummed with life. Birds nested under the eaves, horses whinnied in the corral, and laughter drifted through the open windows of the cabin. Inside, the rhythm of life had settled into something steady and sweet. Clara hummed as she worked, her hands quick and sure. while Elias moved through the days with quiet purpose. There were still few words between them, but there was no need for many. Each glance, each small act of care, those were the language they'd learned to speak. One evening, as the sky blushed pink and gold, Clara stood on the porch, watching the sun dip below the horizon. Elias joined her silently, leaning against the railing. For a long while, neither spoke. The only sound was the chirping of crickets and the distant lowing of cattle. "It's beautiful," she murmured. He nodded, his eyes tracing the horizon. "Haven't seen a summer like this in years." She glanced at him, her tone soft. "Maybe you just weren't looking." He turned to her then, a faint smile tugging at his mouth. She wasn't wrong. For too many years, Elias had lived in a shadow, his heart locked away, his days quiet but empty. Now, as he looked at the young woman beside him, he realized something had changed. She hadn't just brought warmth into his home. She had brought it back into his soul. That night, they shared dinner by the fire. Clara had cooked his favorite, rabbit stew with wild herbs, and as they ate, the conversation flowed more easily than usual. She told him about her plans to start a small garden by the barn, and how she'd been saving seeds from the herbs she'd found in the hills. Elias listened, nodding thoughtfully. "You'll make this place even more alive," he said. Her smile faltered for just a moment, and she looked down at her hands. "It already is," she whispered. "You made it so when you took me in." He set his spoon down and studied her. "I didn't do much," he said quietly. "You did everything," she replied. "You gave me a chance to breathe again, to believe there's more than just surviving." The silence that followed was warm, not heavy. Elias leaned back in his chair, eyes glinting with something she hadn't seen before. Tenderness. "Then maybe," he said softly, "we both got a second chance." Clara's eyes filled with quiet emotion. She reached across the table, her fingers brushing his rough, calloused hand. He didn't pull away. For the first time in years, Elias Ward didn't feel haunted by what he'd lost, only grateful for what he'd found. As the days turned into weeks, the two of them worked together to shape a new life. Clara planted her garden. Elias rebuilt the old barn. They traded supplies with neighbors who, to Elias's surprise, began to visit more often now that the ranch no longer seemed like a place of ghosts. One afternoon, a neighbor's wife came by with a basket of peaches and winked at Clara. "You've done wonders for that man," she said with a laugh. "We thought he'd turned to stone years ago." Clara smiled shyly. "He's softer than he looks." Elias, overhearing from the porch, shook his head but couldn't hide the small grin that crept across his face. By late summer, the ranch was alive in every sense of the word. The garden flourished, the animals thrived, and inside the cabin, laughter came as easily as breathing. On quiet nights, Elias would sit by the fire, Clara's soft humming in the background, and think about how strange life was. How a single knock at the door on a winter's night could rewrite an entire future. Sometimes, he'd catch her looking at him with that same quiet gratitude, and he'd feel it mirrored deep inside himself. She had come to his door asking only for warmth. He had given her shelter, but in doing so, she had given him something far greater, a reason to live again. And as the summer sun dipped low behind the hills, Elias Ward finally understood that home wasn't built from walls or wood. It was built from hearts that chose to stay.